Friends, peace be with you. I would like to introduce a new online program from the International Movement for a Just World, and that's Just Conversations. The Just leadership felt that we should perhaps focus on certain major challenges in international politics, address some of these challenges through the format of a conversation between Just and individuals who are deeply involved in a particular issue. And the first issue that came to our mind is, of course, the genocide in Gaza, the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and the current crisis in the West Bank. It is perhaps the most compelling issue in international politics today. And we have invited as our first guest, Professor Ilan Pappé. Professor Ilan Pappé needs no introduction. He is one of the best known public intellectuals in the world today. He has written extensively on issues related to Palestine, Israel, the West Asia crisis. He has spoken about these through numerous platforms in recent months and recent years. What is unique about Professor Ilan Pappé is not just his scholarship and his contributions as a public intellectual. What is unique about him is his unwavering courage, his integrity, his willingness to stand up for the truth and to tell the truth to power at the global level, in spite of the tremendous sacrifices that he has had to bear at the personal level. It has not prevented him from continuing his mission. And because of that mission, the rest of us, the world as a whole, is a little more enlightened, a little more knowledgeable about what is happening. His wisdom has empowered all of us. Professor Pappé, welcome to this series. Welcome to this first conversation. We are honored to have you with us. Of course, you have been to Malaysia before, and the impact from that visit 4 or 5 years ago is still there. And we hope that we will continue to have dialogues of the sort. Could I begin, Professor Pappé, with a question that is related to what you have been writing and speaking about for a long while, and especially in recent weeks and months. You have talked about the end of the Zionist project, which would, I suppose, confuse some people. Does it appear that the Zionist project is coming to an end? But you have been steadfast in discussing this and analyzing the Zionist project from this particular perspective. I'm just wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on what you mean by the end of the Zionist project, and then maybe we'll talk about other issues related to that and other challenges. Please, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you, Chandra. Thank you so much for your kind and generous introduction. It was indeed a memorable visit for me as well. And I do hope this will not be the last time. And I made many new friends in Malaysia and began dialogues that were very close to my heart and had a huge impact on my writing and thinking. So it's a great opportunity to say thank you to everyone who at the time was involved in that visit and express my great appreciation for the work Just has been doing ever since it was established. You're absolutely right. I do talk in these last 14 or 15 months about the beginning of the end of the Zionist project. And I would stress also the word, the beginning of the end, because my most important perspective on contemporary issues is an historical one. And from an historical perspective, processes are not always revolutionary. Namely, they're not always happening in a big bang and change dramatically within a short period of time a known reality or a for granted reality, as Michel Foucault would have put it. In many cases, what precedes the revolutionary, the fundamental change, is a much more slower process, an evolutionary process of change. And that evolutionary process can take time before it reaches the time of implosion, so to speak. So what I'm talking about is actually with great confidence as a scholar, and not just as an activist or someone who dreams of a better future, but with the confidence of scholarship that I can see the evolutionary processes, not the revolutionary ones, but the evolutionary processes that are bringing us closer to the end of the Zionist project in Palestine. And let me explain what I mean by that. I'm thinking about discrete processes, namely processes that at this stage of their evolution have not much in common with each other, but do have the potential in the future to fuse together to become this implosion, this transformative moment in history. And I try to trace these discrete processes that I think are now quite visible, where they were not always visible. And they really are best understood within an historical context. And the most important historical context is to go back to the very inception of the Zionist idea as a European solution for a European problem. I mean, Europe had a genuine problem with the way it treated its Jewish citizens, not only its Jewish citizens. In fact, racism in Europe was not confined towards the Jews, but undoubtedly the most barbarian, inhuman attack eventually was directed towards the Jews in the genocide of the Jews in the Holocaust. And instead of dealing with that inherent, this deeply fundamental racism that affects the European society on all levels and all walks of life, and dealing it through the victims of the most, the ultimate victims of this racism in the first half of the 20th century and even the late 19th century, instead of dealing with that in Europe itself as a European issue, various elements that one can call the initial Zionist Alliance in the world between evangelical Christians, intellectual Jews, capitalists, imperialists, later also American imperialists. This coalition offered Europe a solution for a European problem outside of Europe. And the idea, if you think about it logically, morally, even practically, the idea that you can solve the problem of Jewish racism, or racism towards the Jews, by forcing a Jewish European state on the Arab world, on the Muslim world, at the expense of the people of Palestine who rejected this idea from the very moment they were aware of it. This is where you can see that in the foundation of that project lies also the reasonable prediction that it cannot be sustained forever. Because the only way of sustaining it, as we have seen, is by force. And force was never enough, so you needed more force. So yes, we can look at the events of the last few months and say Israel succeeded once more to be sustainable, if you want, by inflicting some military defeat on Hamas and Hezbollah, benefiting for some regional developments that weakened the power of Iran as a regional force. That might be all correct as a contemporary analysis. But this does not tell the whole story. And the story is that they hardly managed it. Namely, all the force in the world, and they have huge military power, and they have huge, and they have a very powerful military allies. And yet, they hardly defeated two very small guerrilla movements. They're not even fighting a conventional army. So it means that the future is still based, the sustainability of the Zionist project still can only be maintained by force, and kind of the validity of the project through military power. There were very worrying signs from an Israeli perspective if they look back seriously and honestly on the last 14 months. They got away with it, but would they get away with it in the next time? And is this a way to sustain an organism called a state or a society? So that's one point that I would like to make about the end of Zionism, that the one thing that seems to hold it together and still impress, unfortunately, even rulers in the Arab and Muslim world, which I think is why they still revere Israel and seek normalization with it. Even that analysis, as Israel as the most powerful, potent member state, kind of state in the region, or maybe even the global scene, has to be more critically analyzed. But a sustainability of a project like Zionism, and I come back to the essence of Zionism, solving a European problem by imposing it on the heart of the Arab world, on the heart of the Muslim world. The validity of this process or project is not just about military power. It is about legitimacy as well. And in terms of legitimacy, this project has already been totally debunked. It lost legitimacy in the eyes of the vast majority of the people in the world. We all know the cynical side of politics, and the fact that so many people are lost their faith in this project does not mean that their political elites, unfortunately, would reflect this moral attitude. But yet, this global moral position is important, and is one of these discrete processes that brings the project to an end. So we talk about military weakness, despite the fact that it looks as if they are powerful, losing international legitimacy. In it, there's a very important group that lost its faith in the Zionist project, and these are the Jews of the world, especially the younger Jewish generation, and in particular in the United States. Without the support of Jewish community, the very raison d'etre of the Zionist project as a solution for anti-Semitism is annulled, is kind of taken out of is invalidated immediately if this is the fact. To this, you can of course add the processes, and we might talk about it, and I will finish soon this answer. Also the processes around Israel. People in the global north in particular in the global west, have this tendency to accept the Israeli kind of imagery, which dislocates Israel from the Arab world and the Eastern Mediterranean or the West Asia, as if even geographically and physically it belongs to Europe, but it doesn't. Israel is Palestine, and Palestine is part of the Eastern Mediterranean or Western Asia. And Western Asia is undergoing now dramatic changes in the political structure. We've seen it in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq. The whole colonial structure of nation states built by Britain and France after the First World War is also collapsing. And it's so interesting that in London and in Washington, people would say to you, yes, but this has nothing to do with Israel, as if Israel is on a different planet. Of course it has to do with Israel, because Israel is also the fruit of that colonial structure that was built after the First World War and is not holding on. So you take this together and you add to this economic weaknesses. And the most important one, maybe, and with this I would end, we have seen it already before the 7th of October, the implosion of the Israeli society from within, the inability of secular and religious Jews to agree of what Judaism is all about, what is the essence of a Jewish state. Regardless of even the Palestinian issue, this is kind of an internal Jewish civil war that is not going to be resolved. It's not going to be resolved because religion cannot be nationalism. And you cannot build a state only on the identity of a religion. And that has nothing even to do with everything else we've talked about. That by itself is a bomb waiting to implode from within. So for all these reasons, I think we are, and people should remember it, especially people who are victims of the Zionist project, that the project that caused them so much suffering in the past and causes them suffering at the present will not be there forever. And actually, they should also strategize for the day that such a collapse would happen, because if they won't strategize, a collapse can create chaos for a very long time, and chaos is not a good scenario for anyone.
Thank you very much, Ilan. There are many important points that you raised. Some of them we could perhaps try to adumbrate upon, while others, I'm sure, will reemerge in the course of your answers. Yeah. Now, one of them is about the economic situation in Israel. You alluded to it. Is it a matter of concern that more than 500,000 people have left Israel since October 7th, 2023? And many of them are talented people with skills, knowledge, and so on. Does this exodus indicate that within the Jewish community itself, and some of the most committed Jews are found in Israel, that within the Jewish community, there is a sort of erosion of faith in the Jewish state? Does it indicate that? And shouldn't the leaders, those who run Israel and those who support Israel, shouldn't they be concerned about this? That there is this exodus that is taking place on a scale that has not happened before. When Israel requires its own citizens to defend Israel, the way they see the situation, self-defense and all the rest of it, and yet people are leaving. What are your thoughts on that, Ilan?
Yeah, I think that's a symptom of the process I was talking about, definitely, and a very important one.
Yeah.
We don't, of course, the Israeli Bureau of Statistics tries to hide the exact numbers. And
Yes.
some journalists in Israel even think that the number is even higher.
Mm.
And definitely nobody questions the fact that how much, whatever the number is, that we are talking here about a brain drain of the emigration of people who are part of the social, economic, and cultural, I would say even military elite of Israel. So definitely this is a very significant development. What also characterizes the people who left was that the kind of Israel that they thought they had built and hoped for, which was, in their own terms, a more liberal, pluralist, open society, nonetheless, of course, uh, still believing in their right to maintain an apartheid system towards the Palestinians, wherever they are. But in that kind of liberal version of Zionism, that they thought they had succeeded in building over 76 years, is not unfolding. On the contrary, what the state of Israel that they wanted is being slowly but constantly swallowed by a new state. I call it the state of Judea, the state of the settlers that grew up in the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, a very dangerous fusion of Jewish messianism with fundamentalism and racism, and that kind of neo-Zionist messianic ideology does not only target the Palestinians, it also targets the Jews who are regarded as secular or liberal. And they are really kind of running away from a sinking ship. So it's not Ilan Pappé who says that he thinks that the Zionist project is on on the brink of a disaster. They vote with their feet,
Mm.
probably with a similar analysis to mine, even if they don't articulate that analysis. And that's important because they are the ones who know better even than I do what goes on in the state. And they feel that they and their families have no future there. Again, one should not be misled. This is not a protest against the way Israel treats the Palestinians.
That's right.
But it's definitely a fundamental process that undermines the social cohesion of the state, its potency, whether it's economic or military, and so on. And I think that this is something that is not going to end very quickly because despite Benjamin Netanyahu's declaration of huge military success, it has to be remembered that the attrition war is still going on, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. And the Israeli soldiers pay a price for that. It's not, it's not over as far as they are concerned. And all in all, it's very clear that while this is happening, the state of Judea is taking over the legal institutions, the media, the military, the security services. So even if it will succeed to, kind of oppress the Palestinians longer, it is not convincing enough as a future state for its own citizens. And so I think, yes, it's one of the most important indications that we are indeed not viewing the beginning of a new chapter, but the end of an old chapter, the chapter of the ongoing Nakba, of the catastrophe, of the colonization. It's not over yet, absolutely true. And as we know from history, sometimes the last chapter or the last phase in such a chapter can be very cruel, very ruthless, as we have seen in the case of apartheid South Africa, even in some colonialist rules. Think about the French ruthless oppression of the Algerians toward the end of the collapse of the French settler colonial project in Algeria. So we should be aware and even understand why we are seeing such a level of brutality. Even the level of brutality, it's terrible to say this, but it's also an indicator that this is not working. That's why I'm saying we are in the end of this chapter. And probably as an activist, I would do all I can with everyone else to shorten that chapter. But I'm aware where I am, I think, historically in it right now.
Thank you, Ilan. If I may sort of explore one of the other sub-themes that you alluded to, here we have a state which is in a crisis, which the elite refuse to come to terms with, but it is in crisis. But in spite of that, when it comes to the question of the Palestinians, the oppression of the Palestinians, the marginalization, the state has made no concession at all. Meaning by which, they are still as hard, as ruthless, as inhuman as they have been in the past. In other words, they don't see it as something that should compel them to act differently. And in that sense, Ilan, they're different, this Israeli elite, from colonial powers in history. You look at the colonial elites in India, you look at the colonial elites in Indonesia, you're familiar with all these situations, when things were changing and they knew that people were against them, that they could not continue, they tried to make some changes here and there, which didn't work, of course, but they had to adjust or they had to take into account the changing mood of the people. But this Israeli elite, it's just amazing. So I'm just wondering, Ilan, whether you have some insights into this. Why do they behave in this manner?
Very, very good question, Chandra. I'm thinking about even the white elite in South Africa, a person like de Klerk eventually understands the situation
Yeah,
and releases Nelson Mandela from
yeah,
prison and understand that he has no choice
yeah.
if something has to be salvaged and so on. And to think at all that there would be in the future an Israeli de Klerk is even quite an illusion, I think. So you're absolutely right about describing the phenomenon. Now let's see if we can explain why it is
Mhm.
that way. I think and that needs probably even more thinking than I can afford right now, but I can provide some partial
Mm,
kind of analysis here. I think that there is two sort of levels of immunity, or two aspects of immunity that Israel was granted by the international community at large, and particularly the global north, that is part of the explanation for this
mm,
inability, this blindness,
mm,
uh, to see the connection between, even the simplest connection between the oppression of the Palestinians and the situation of the state.
mm,
From a perspective of, let's say, a normal Israeli who still wants to live in a relatively free country and so on. And they cannot see it. We absolutely can be certain that they don't see the connection. Now, one level of immunity has to do with victimhood. And I think that the fact that the West decided to allow Israel to become the representative of the ultimate victim of the Second World War, which was historically not true,
mm,
a fabrication of history, but nonetheless, this is a position that Israel was granted, mainly, I think, because the West thought that through this position of being the ultimate victim of the Second World War, Israel would help the West to reintegrate Germany, post-Nazi Germany, into the Western camp because of the Cold War. And it was clear that legitimacy, so you have two stages here. If you recognize Israel as the representative of not only the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, but of all the victims of the Nazi extermination machine, then if Israel gives legitimacy to a new Germany, even before it was denazified, and it wasn't immediately denazified, then you are gaining the integration of Germany into the global West, which was very important for the Americans in particular, in order to win the Cold War against the Soviet Union. So that's one level, which I think, and if you are growing, and I know because I'm a product of the Israeli educational system, that's the way we were brought up. We are not only we are the ultimate victims of the world, we deserve everything we want, and we are forgiven and absolved from everything we do, because we're not even whatever we will do does not come close to what had been done to us. And that is a very important part of the Israeli mentality. Now, of course, by the time we get to the genocide of Gaza, we begin to question whether, even if we accept for a moment that Israel represents the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, is Israel that far away from doing to the Palestinians what had been done to the Jews? But let's put it aside for a moment. From their perspective, and this is an insane, it's a sick nation in that respect, but the world is also responsible for that. It's the Western world, saying that, whatever you do, it doesn't compare to what had been done to you. And therefore, okay, we can turn a blind eye to this. So that's one level of immunity that's very ingrained into the Israeli mindset and DNA. The second level of immunity is more practical, and that is in order to sustain this impossible project of building a Jewish state at the heart of the Arab world, you needed a very powerful alliance. I call it the Global Israel Alliance. And that alliance has to be very powerful, because it goes against the grain of history and against the will of the people. So it cannot be just NGOs, it has to be powerful government, multinational corporation, military industries. So when you have the backup of such powerful people and institutions, you feel like that you don't need to do these moral analyses of your situation. So the only calculations you do are practical, cons and pros, balance of power, and so on. What they miss, of course, and that I can tell them as an historian until I lose my voice, but they're not listening. What they lose, of course, is the fact that even these balances of power, whether they're economic or political, are eventually also connected to the will of people, to the moral values of people. They may not always be that. And the neoliberal capitalist Western system is very good in trying to annul any moral validity to their actions. But history is not made only of the last 100 or even 200 years of the ascendance of the West. History is, and I felt it in Malaysia, among other places, history has a much longer history of civilization. It doesn't begin with the West, and it doesn't end with the West. And in those other civilizations, these issues and these civilizations are not gone. They're still with us. This kind of immunity will be questioned, will be challenged, if you want, by a global Palestine that is based on other elements. And I think we are beginning to see it. When I see Native Americans in the United States, people in Kashmir, in Bengal, who are refugees from India, and Palestinians are now joining together in conversations about justice and injustice, also with the First Nations in Australia and so on. You begin to understand that this other alliance is there, maybe not as powerful, but is getting powerful by the day and much more intersectional. And therefore, I think that kind of thing can change. But this is definitely, this is the mindset of the Israelis. And I agree. Even compared to, the French colonialist elite, the white South African apartheid elite, even the British elite in India.
Yeah.
All of these elites showed some sort of pragmatism or connection to the reality in the end of the day. They were not our cup of tea, but they did.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. The disconnect from what goes on around them is quite remarkable, and I think it has to do a lot with this, the way this kind of creature called the State of Israel was conceived and nurtured over the years.
Very good, Ilan. I think it's been extremely insightful, your penetrative analysis of certain aspects of a phenomenon which I think is very complex, very, very complex phenomenon. But could I try to perhaps develop one aspect of it? Because it's something that concerns all of us, and it has concerned you for a long while too. To what extent do you think, Ilan, the future of the Zionist project is dependent upon US-led hegemony? Meaning by which that, yes, the impunity and all the rest of it, and the power of all the institutions behind Israel, all that is true. But having said that, from what we are witnessing, and especially a point that you alluded to, a certain upsurge in feelings, and it revolves around Palestine. In the last 14 months, we have seen this. And I think it is very significant from that point of view that Palestine has become the rallying point for a lot of groups all over the world for justice, for liberation, and all the rest of it. And I'm just wondering whether the changes that are taking place in the global system, which will undoubtedly continue to weaken the United States of America. I mean, the era of US hegemony that was most obvious perhaps in the 80s for a while, and then in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think that era of US global hegemony is over forever because of the rise of China. And the rise of China is a phenomenon in itself. It is unlike other changes that we have seen in the global sphere. Apart from the rise of China, I think, in a sense, the reassertion of Russian military power, that's also a phenomenon that one can't ignore. And if you look at other countries that have come up, and they are playing their roles, including countries like, Korea, culturally a very important center, which is challenging, the dominant cultural ethos, and that will have an impact upon the structures of power. Now, all these things are happening. Yeah? And even if you look at a country which seems to be in a bit of a mess at the moment, Iran, I think the larger sentiments connected with a certain notion of autonomy generated by Islamic resurgence. And there are many elements in Islamic resurgence, Ilan, as you know, which I'm very critical of, But if you look at a certain aspect of it, autonomy, I think that is also challenging the dominant West in different ways. Latin America, I think it's very significant. If at one time it was just Cuba, look at the situation today. It has become different. Africa, you see this change, taking place. So do you think the end of global hegemony led by the United States would be an important precondition for the liberation of Palestine?
Yes, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. We can see this change in the global constellation,
Yeah.
and what at first looked like a unipower international system after the collapse of the Soviet Union,
yeah,
is now definitely a multi-power system, not a unipower system. And absolutely, China is one of the most important challenger to that unipower. And with China and other rising countries such as Brazil,
yeah,
the new South Africa, and definitely, I do think in the future, a more reformed Iran as well. And hopefully some of the large Muslim countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. All of that will bring a different kind of perspective of the international system as a whole, with very important implications for the situation in Palestine.
mm,
Because whether this would be a reflection, a democratic reflection, if you want, of what so many people in the societies in this country would have liked their states to do towards the question of Palestine, or whether it would be a bit more cynical, practical approach to the question of Palestine, which sometimes the Chinese adopt when it comes to conflicts in the world. Either way, it will be very different from the immunity and exceptionalism that Israel enjoys in a world that is dominated by American politics, and especially a Middle East that is dominated by American hegemony. Again, whether it would be for what probably you and I would regard as the right reason, or whether it would be for less noble reasons, it doesn't matter. In the end
yeah,
of the day, you will have global intervention or an international dimension to the question of Palestine, which is very, very different
mm,
from the days of the American hegemony. And,
yeah,
and one of the most important things about all these countries that you have mentioned, they didn't take part in the inception of this idea of the Zionist project in imposing a European Jewish state on the Arab world. That's a very different perspective. They are not complicit
yeah,
in what happened to the Palestinians, as the Americans are, as the Britain definitely are, but also Europe as a whole is.
yeah,
And that gives them, it liberates them in dealing with the question of Palestine in a day that in a way that could only benefit the Palestinians. Was one of the issues, and we can see it in day-to-day politics in Europe. Politicians are afraid of challenging Israel because of that complicity, because of
mm,
that complex relationship between Europe and the creation of the Jewish state and maintaining the Jewish state in the Arab world. The countries you mentioned, the new rising international powers, don't have this kind of a problem or challenge.
mm,
That's the first
mm,
one, right, which is
no,
very important.
no,
Secondly, what is very impressive, whether you go to Latin America or Africa or Southeast Asia, which is very different when you visit the global West. Palestine is firmly located in their eyes in the Arab world. It's an organic part of the Arab world. They don't regard it as a body that belongs to Europe, as an organ that is alien to the body in which it exists, you know. And this organic perception, and you can see it if you look at the way you talk to even Brazilian diplomats or Malaysian diplomats or Korean, you mentioned Korean diplomats. First of all, you know, from perspective of Malaysia, for instance, to include Palestine in West Asia is one way of taking it outside
yeah,
the European Western orbit,
yeah,
just by two words, you know, two
yeah,
small words for for the Israelis is a different perspective, but it's much more than Asia. It
yeah,
is really almost reimagining and recollecting the fact that before the end of the First World War, actually before even the Nakba, before 1948, Palestine was organically connected to the countries around it. It was connected in a cultural way, an economic way, in a political way. It shared the vision of these people for the future. They have familial connections. It was the same language, in many cases, the same religions, or same religions, even in plural. And
Yeah.
that was a very organic human body that was developing all the time and was disrupted by Zionism and imperialism. And I think taking the Americans out of the equation brings back the potential. So it's not just a matter of changing the balance of global power.
Mm.
For me, it is creating for the first time an opportunity for a better future, which is not just about decolonization and liberation, because these, as we know from history, can be sometimes violent processes that do not always produce a post-colonial situation, which is far better than the one that was before that. In order to make sure that decolonization leads indeed to a better model, it cannot be a Western model. Cannot be a model that was built as long as the United States was dominating the sea.
Mm.
But the models that existed, in fact, that the Americans have disrupted or tried to destroy in order to protect their own interests in the area. And I think that's why it's so positive to see that kind of change happening in front of our eyes.
Yeah. Very good point, Ilan, And I was just wondering, as we come to the end of our conversation, whether we should also look at perhaps one of the major internal problems that we haven't alluded to, so far, compared to so many other struggles, anti-colonial struggles and struggles, for self-determination and so on. What is perhaps unique about Palestine? One of the many features that may be unique about the Palestinian struggle, that after so many decades, it is still divided. You can see it in what's happened in the last week, the Palestinian Authority and, the way they're playing this game in the West Bank, And this, compared to Vietnam, if you compare to South Africa, even though there were other groups, but still, people knew that they had to rally around, a certain masthead, in order to mobilize the people and so on. But in the case of Palestine, somehow it doesn't seem to be working. It's partly because, I suppose, you have Israeli propaganda and politics and so on the one hand, but also, I think, problems within the Palestinian struggle itself. I'm just wondering whether you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. Before talking about the Palestinian accountability,
Yeah,
that kind of fragmentation and disunity that is so visible, unfortunately, and as you write, painfully visible in the operation of the PA in the Jenin refugee camp just
yeah,
the other day. I think before talking about that accountability, we have to remember, of course, as you mentioned, that fragmenting the Palestinians was part of the Zionist strategy to begin with.
yeah.
And the Palestinians are a bit unique than other victims of colonialism because they were suffering from divide and rule policies of a colonial power and
Yeah.
immediately moved to be victims of divide and rule policies of a settler colonial regimes. And there was no the
Mm,
continuity of Palestinians' victimization
yeah,
by oppressive powers that seek to divide them is unique by itself and can explain a bit the problems of the Palestinians to produce unity in the face of the challenges that they are confronted with. However, there's no point in not allowing accountability for what's happening there for the Palestinian society itself. In fact, it was so sad about this society that it was such a pastoral society that had its own mechanism of live and let live before Zionism arrived, and some that even were sustained during the mandatory period. But of course, in many ways, were disappeared after 48, although one of the great success of the PLO in the 1960s was to reunite the Palestinians under one vision
mm,
until it all went awry roughly in the beginning of the 1980s. So we have historically periods of unity and periods of disunity. It's not just a whole. So that's my first point. It's not a continuous history of disunity. And I suppose one of the way to inspire unity in the future is to remember the periods of unity and be encouraged by them and learn from them. The other point is that definitely the Oslo approach with its alleged and false pretense to be a peace process contributed to this disarray and this dysfunctional state of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. And this is a problem that, as you rightly alluded to, and I think everybody, even among the Palestinians, would agree, this is only something the Palestinians can solve. We cannot solve it for them. Where I do draw encouragement is from the younger Palestinian generation. Despite the fact that they are also fragmented geographically in different parts of Palestine, different parts of the Arab world and the world at large, unlike the previous generation, because of the new technology at hand, they are far more communicating with each other, even when they are far apart geographically. And that, if you look at that communication, and much of it is public, so one can attune to it, it is far more united, far more uniform, and there is far more a common vision on the one hand, and there's much less factionalism on the other. So I do think that, when I talk about the end of Zionism or the beginning of the end, I'm also thinking about the processes that would turn the end into the beginning of something better. Because I say this is not for granted. A house can be collapsed and a very bad house can be built instead of it,
Yeah.
kind of. So, and now I'm talking about the second part of it. How do we build a better house? Not how we bring down the bad one, so to speak. And part of it is, of course, dramatic changes within the Palestinian liberation movement, the creation of a unified, democratic, representative bodies and leadership. But I do believe this is actually being discussed very seriously now by the young Palestinians, wherever they are. It's very difficult to focus on it when your own people are being genocided in the Gaza Strip, oppressed elsewhere. So I'm not blaming them for not devoting too much time to strategizing, but I think they will have to, at the same time that they resist, also to strategize about the future. And the future has very important questions. No less important among them is giving the Jews an idea of how they see the Jewish collective in the future liberated Palestine, and things like that. But I think it's beginning to unfold, and therefore I do believe that there is a very good potential that it would not be the only one, but one of the important kind of mini revolutions that would help us transform the decolonization into something better is this fundamental change in the way Palestinian politics is being practiced, performed, and kind of conveyed to the rest of the world by the younger generation that would remind us of the more glorious days of that liberation movement in the past.
Yeah. It's an interesting response, which provides some hope for the future. My last question, Ilan, unless of course you've got other comments you'd like to make,
I
and
think,
please, feel free to make,
yeah.
comments. I'm just wondering if, in talking about young Palestinians trying to construct a future for themselves, and the sort of signs and symbols of hope that they have here and there, do you feel that a phenomenon that has emerged very strongly in the Arab world and in the Muslim world as a whole in the last 30, 40 years, what many people have described as a sort of religious resurgence? and the notion of a state related to that, religious resurgence, giving birth to a state which has a certain projection of its identity. And would that be a sort of dysfunctional force in the future? And as someone who is not from the Muslim community, Ilan, I'm just wondering whether you could perhaps look at it objectively,
Yeah.
this thing, that perhaps this may be one of the challenges and it has not been well addressed within the Muslim world.
No, it hasn't. I fully agree. And
Yeah,
sometimes I think people don't distinguish properly between the popularity of such ideologies and movements because of the failure of more secular,
yeah,
even leftist, if you want, factions of liberation movements to deliver
yeah.
anything. And that naturally leads people to say, let's give a chance to a different concept, even if that concept is not fully accepted by these people or is not fully analyzed, because what matters is to bring down an occupation, or in the case of
Correct.
Syria, a very ruthless and cruel dictatorship. It doesn't matter. So you can understand the popularity, and you don't have to fall into the Western Orientalist analysis that this popularity means that every Muslim that is supporting such movements right now is fully behind visions that maybe some of them would be too fundamental, too radical, and irrelevant even to the 21st century. So I think that's one distinction we should make between analyzing the popularity of these movements and notions to the and the real reasons for supporting them. Now, in the long run, and I think that there is an interesting discussion in the more traditional movements that produce these kind of notions, like the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Egypt, which is quite a veteran, from the late 1920s. I read a lot of what they produced recently and so on. And this is far more complex and more profound, and to my mind, more hopeful for the way a future should be built. And it goes back to history and the history of particularly the place where Palestine is, but I think it will be true about Southeast Asia and Africa as well, everywhere where you have large Muslim communities, that the past has these moments. And in the case of the Middle East, that moment was not that distant. I'm talking about at least the first half of the 19th century, where people, whether they were Muslims or not Muslims, felt they were part of a civilization, not religion, civilization that was built by centuries by Muslims, mainly by Muslims, but with a very close alliance with non-Muslims, especially people from from other monotheistic religions. And that created a mosaic of live and let live, of a dialogue as a way of life, not as a means of solving problem, but as a way of life, namely resigning to the idea that not everything is agreed upon, but there are certain rules. So I think that I hope, first of all, I hope, and I'm definitely even individually involved in this, that this kind of resurgence, as you rightly call it, which is more a product of the predicament of our times, the crisis, the existential crisis that faces Muslim in many places in the world. They are really facing existential threats in India, in Kashmir, in Palestine, I mean, and maybe in south of Thailand as well. That this kind of reaction to the existential dangers and to years of racism and Islamophobia and so on, I can understand the initial reaction as having this more fundamental, purist sometimes, and fanatical at times even reaction. But I do think from history that this can also bring forth a softer, more complex kind of model of coexistence. And if you think about it, in the 17th century, the Wahhabiyya in the Arabian Peninsula, reacting to the entrance of the West, began as a very severe kind of reaction. But later on, there was this dialectical relationship between ideas that came from the West, ideas that were part of Islamic heritage, so much manifested in the personality and writings of the great Sheikh of Al-Azhar, Muhammad Abdo, and people like him. And there were similar people in North Africa and in Southeast Asia. We have a tendency to think that the West is the supermarket ideas we should shop in, which is not true. And secondly, that everything has to be invented. Some of the good ideas of how to respect Islamic civilization and yet not to give up the fruitful mosaic that flourished and brought societies to the apex of their successes. Some of these ideas are a bit, were already conceived before us. We should respect them. And we should not think that we all have the answers without relying on the wisdom of our past great minds. And I think this is something to work on. It won't be easy. It won't be easy because of so many external interventions in this. But I do think it has a great potential. And maybe I'm a bit biased, and with this I would end. Palestine in particular has this history. Maybe because it was so sacred to three monotheistic religions. Palestine has this period, and I'm writing with a friend now a book about it, Palestine between 1750 and 1850. It's kind of 100 years of Renaissance. And that Renaissance in Palestine was very much reassured by a very positive connection between Christians and Jews and other denominations and the Islamic civilization, while not being alien to Europe, but also understanding the dangers of Europe. And I think that kind of, it was both on an intellectual level, but also on a popular cultural level. And I think that kind can also build in the future also a political structures that would reflect this kind of dialogical, if you want, reality.
Yeah. Thanks, Ilan. I'm tempted to pick on one of your points because I'm from Southeast Asia. And, there are two countries in Southeast Asia, Muslim majority countries. And one, of course, is the country with the largest Muslim population in the world, and that's Indonesia. If you look at Indonesia and how it had, at least at the spiritual, perhaps intellectual level, dealt with the question of religious plurality, and at the same time, tried to assert a certain notion of a deeper spirituality. Look at its constitution. Believe in God, the oneness of God is the first principle, but it is a principle that is used to reassert the idea of diversity, of religious diversity, not just ethnic diversity, and same thing with Malaysia. After many years, after the Indonesian experiment, we had a charter in Malaysia. And in that charter, too, the first principle is belief in God in a multi-religious society. So how one interprets that belief, in God in a multi-religious society where you see the validity of a divinity that goes beyond religious boundaries. I think that's what one is trying to say. And I think that has a deeper, meaning. And it's a pity that the type of Islamic resurgence that has taken place in a number of countries has not been able to come to terms with this. But then groups outside that, and surprisingly, many of them are secular groups, they're able to see this. And they're able to see this as something which may contribute to a better future.
I do believe
more
so.
enlightening future, yes. And I'm sure that's something which you would be very interested in also, Ilan, this sort
Absolutely,
of thing. Yeah.
absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
Ilan, thank you very, very much. We spent
Chandra.
about an hour, and it's been amazing. And I've known you for a few years now, but I find that today's discussion, dialogue went much deeper in certain areas.
Thank you.
And I hope we would be able to disseminate this widely, if that's okay with you, because all just
Of course,
interviews, we
of course.
disseminate them, and we'll put up on our own website and other websites, send it to people, individuals, groups, and, so on, because I think there is a lot that one can learn from the ideas which you shared with us in this conversation. Yeah, it's been very, very enlightening. It has been illuminating. And I wish we can do this again in the future.
I do hope so. I'm really looking forward
Yeah,
to doing it.
yeah,
I
we can
do.
do this
I
in the
definitely
future.
do.
And maybe, we should bring you to this part of the world again quite
I
soon.
would love to do
Yes,
that as
we'd
well.
love to do that.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
All
Chandra.
the best.
All the best.
You were
Thank you.
really,
Thank you.
sort of happy and proud to have a person like you in our midst.
Same
It's so
here. Thank you
important,
so much. I'm really
so
honored.
important.
Thank you so
Right.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks.
Bye bye.
Thanks, Ilan.